Dan, Viv, I don't really know how to begin this one. Dan, welcome back.
We never really know whether we're going to do the let's record a little bit afterwards to introduce the thing. So it's like,
yeah, exactly.
Do we introduce the person that we're talking to, or are we going to do it?
Oh yeah, true.
Anyway, our guest this week needs no introduction. I think, Viv, you're our first repeat guest.
I was wondering about this, and I was hoping so, but
yeah,
that is true. That is true. Returning podcast friend of the show. Look at that.
Yeah, we use that phrase ironically sometimes, but in all sincerity, this week we are joined by friend of the show, Viv.
Minus the sass. Great.
Yeah, exactly. Viv, I feel like now we're probably going to get into a route when we bring you on when we need to have some sort of science correspondent. So we have you again. To discuss Marxism as science, to discuss is Marxism science, to discuss the the applicability of the term scientific to various socialist projects. Why don't you just go ahead and introduce what we're going to be talking to you about and where people can read it just right off the bat.
So I recently wrote an essay for the Black Lamp, which is really focused on trying to critically evaluate Marxism's scientific content. Now, there's lots of stuff that has done this in various ways, and I kind of think this diverges in two directions. You have sort of the neo-Kautskian direction, which is really focused on the idea of Marxism as a science, and therefore we use this scientific aspect to develop strategy. But there's a lot of assumptions there, and it's never really explored what we mean by science in that respect. And I found quite often, and this is by no means just that tendency that does this, but I especially noticed this after Corbynism and stuff like that, where when things are going well, you have people talking about a strategy, and this is the strategy we should pursue. But then when it all goes to shit, what you have is, there's a betrayal narrative. This person betrayed us, that person betrayed us. And so you never get to a point where you can critically evaluate these things, because there's always some sort of outlier. And that's the reason why we can still kind of focus on the same strategy. And so you don't really make any sort of progress in that sense. Now, the alternative route is there's been a lot written about Marxism as science, but that's mainly from a philosophical angle, and it's very academic-y, and it doesn't really touch actual action, practical action. It doesn't really address strategies itself. Usually these do perform quite rigorous criticisms of classical Marxism, but don't really get beyond that. So I thought, I work in I'm a population geneticist, so obviously science is of interest to me. I'm a Marxist, and so I thought maybe just working through the steps of asking questions around what do we actually mean when we say science? What do we mean when we say strategy? What do we mean when we say Marxism? And trying to critically interrogate some of these assumptions in each of those and seeing if it makes any headway. And so some of it was a bit exploratory, and then I don't really come out with any massive conclusions of, no, this is the right strategy or anything. I wouldn't presume to. But I don't know. I found it very useful in writing it, and hopefully it was relatively useful for some people reading it.
Yeah, I think my interaction with so-called scientific socialism has always been kind of a negative one, and I think probably because I didn't necessarily understand what was supposed to be meant by that, not necessarily what is meant by that when people say it. Because most of the time when you hear people say scientific socialism, it's usually a dig at somebody else, and it's not actually a positive contribution to what they're saying. They're just kind of trying to whatever the intelligence version of virtue signaling is, they're just kind of trying to be I know much more about Marxism than you. I'm a scientific socialist. What I liked about this paper is that you actually outline using Marx and Engels, no, there is a version of Marxism that is scientific, and it isn't a sectarian thing. It's actually about how you approach your research project and how you approach what it is that you're trying to do, and not necessarily how right you think you are. Because more often than not, right, it's about what you do when you realize that you're wrong. If that's a fair way of saying it, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. And I guess one of the other problems is that when we talk about like evaluating Marxism's scientific content, it falls into, oh well, what did Marx actually think, and that becomes the focus. And we know that Marx's thought obviously changed massively during his lifetime, in works that were published and unpublished, and even in the essay, like I think one of my favourite passages from Marx is that passage from the preface to the German edition of Volume 1 of Capital, where he talks about like his actual methodological approach, where in the physical sciences you can use something like a microscope and you can actually like physically look at your object of study, and you can't do that when you're trying to analyze a society. And that's very different to some of his earlier stuff that's much more in line with stuff like Engels from Anti-Düring and Dialectics of Nature, which is more scientific in the sense of it has this linear conception of history in it. So quite often the debate is around which one was the real Marx, and you can kind of have both being the real Marx, and kind of in some ways it's irrelevant, right? It doesn't matter that much what he believed. I think rather than these being academic debates, we can like lean into what they actually mean. But yeah, scientific socialism, I guess it hasn't been helped by the phrase the immortal science of Marxism-Leninism. Yeah, which I wanted to include a dig at, but I thought it was low-hanging fruit, so I just avoided it entirely.
We have never been ones to avoid low-hanging fruit, so it's never done.
I feel like it's quite an important comment to make on Marx, though, in that like his various theories, maybe some even potential contradictions in various parts of his writing, how it developed, how his thinking developed through his life, like points out the fact that he is doing science in a way that you've sort of described in this book, right? Like it's actually a matter of developing a theory, engaging the world, sort of testing that theory against observational data, changing the sort of like analysis predicated on what you find, kind of thing. So like,
I thought you were going to say changing the auxiliary statements.
Yeah,
a plug.
I feel like that's later on in the episode. We might need to define some terms, even though this podcast is called auxiliary statements. I still don't presume.
Yeah, that's the trick. That's why we got you on.
Yeah. We finally decided we had to have somebody else explain the title of the podcast to our
audience. One thing I kind of wanted to talk about before we got too much into the actual like Marxist angles and like kind of weighing the supposed scientific nature of some of these different Marxist research projects, was to just kind of talk a little bit about like why it is necessary to have a philosophy of science, right? Because so often now we're just kind of told, I don't know, it's just like the bourgeois view of science is very much just like a positivistic one. It's just like you're doing science when you get in the lab and you do your research and you put on your little white coat, like you're looking for the eternal truth that is out there, and we will get there one day. You give a really good introduction, I think, in this paper to various different types of the philosophies of history, but then also spend some time talking about like why it's necessary to have one. Although it does seem like you wind up saying having one view of the philosophy of science is maybe not possible.
Yeah, I think there's this distinction between an idealized conception of science and then what science actually looks like in practice. And so quite often, I guess what we might refer to as bourgeois science, we assume it's just concerned with like induction and then falsification. So we try to isolate variables so we can basically clear out the noise of other processes influencing our variables of interest, and then we can try and evaluate the relationship between them. But in actual fact, I mean, science has moved a long way from that. It's not a case that isn't done, but both with some of the stuff like you guys have talked about in terms of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics, but also just in terms of having enough things like computational power and data to analyze much more complex systems and appreciate that those complex systems means that like this practice of science has almost in some ways come to terms with some of the Marxist critiques of science in terms of I didn't really talk about Levins and Lewontin in this essay, but really when they're critiquing things like Cartesian reductionism, there are certainly aspects of bourgeois science which have moved away from that, and so it's striking that you almost don't need the language of Marxism to critique science anymore. You can do that within like there are I guess bourgeois frameworks to have these conversations, and then I guess what is it? What are we left with? What do we mean by science anymore? And so, sure, induction has to be a part of it. Sure, there must be some ability to falsify, but that in practice that's not the case. Theories are worked on even once there's been some falsification of them, and so then you start getting into more complex theories of science. You have Thomas Kuhn, of course, who very much historicizes science. Like there's no hard and fast, there's nothing is static. Everything is historicized. So there's no rational reason why theories are chosen and why theories are thrown out. It's going to depend on social influences. And of course, we know that is true as Marxists as well. But if you take that to its logical conclusion, then you lose any distinction between science and like any other like mode of investigation, because it's all based on social and historical conditions. And so I think there's bits you can take from all of these, and I like Imre Lakatosh's framework. I by no means think that that's like the last word on science, but the idea of you have these research programs which can be progressive or degenerated, and how you determine that is dependent on not so much just their predictive power, but their power to account for changes, whether you're just when the data no longer matches your theory, what happens from there? And a lot of this is centered around the idea of you have your core theory, which basically that can't be changed or evaluated, but you have these this belt of positive heuristics or auxiliary statements, and these are what can be evaluated and changed and tweaked. And when we can tweak these without throwing out the core theory, we have something like a progressive research program. And that's really the framework I kind of use. And I think that's a useful framework for evaluating Marxism's scientific content. But even that, like that's by no means like a hard and fast definition of science. And I think Paul Feyerabend, I always get that name mispronounced. He basically argues that there's no hard and fast definition of science, and I think that's probably right. So what we can take is a number of heuristics that we can then use to like analyze various frameworks and see whether they do have any scientific content.
Mm-hmm. There was something you said at the beginning of this, I think, which I found really interesting, which was about a lot of energy going into determining what a science is by philosophers of science, but actually the scientists are just doing science nonetheless without necessarily like needing to have a definition kind of thing, which put it in a different perspective for me. In some ways, like lessening the like grandiose pedestal to put science on kind of thing, and sort of breaking it down in that way was really useful, I suppose.
Yeah, there's definitely a case. Like I've spoken to colleagues and had these conversations, and largely, if you ask most scientists what science is, you're likely to get something about induction, something about falsification. Even though in their day-to-day practice they are doing something that doesn't fall along those hard and fast lines. It's just something that they're just not really thought about. And I'm not saying that's a good thing, because I think it's important to think about these things. But then on the flip side, you have this whole literature in the philosophy of science, which kind of often, though not always, will engage with this idealized conception of science, because it is obviously divorced from the practice to some extent.
What sense do you get that the study of science, in terms of kind of all of the different things that we're talking about what it actually means to study science? This isn't in the paper, so I'm kind of just bringing this on you. And Dan, if you have any thoughts on this too, but what sense do you get that in a classless society, all of this stuff would be different in terms of the way in which we study the natural world, the way in which we engage in it socially, and attempt to study it, I guess?
I think the sort of shift towards analyzing more complex systems, appreciating that complexity, already starts looking something like what we'd like want to see under some sort of classless society. What you notice though is how that, I think I talked about this maybe briefly last time I was on, well, this butts head with like the profit motive right now, because studying complex systems is a slow, often laborious process, because you're accounting for things that you might not even know are there until you do your first like layer of investigation and you keep moving forward. And the scientific, academia is all about churning out papers, and so if you can do something hard and fast and just basically try and isolate things and not worry about what is the complexity I'm not accounting for, that's going to prove likely more useful to your career. So in that way, you're incentivized to keep things as like moving as rapidly as possible. In terms of scientific knowledge, I think again it's about like democratizing this stuff in like as true a way as possible, in everyone having access to, not necessarily everyone being able to walk into a lab and just do what they want, but everyone having the capacity and the access to learn the underlying knowledge and frameworks to do that. So having the capability to both practice and critique science and scientific practice.
I do like that, because a lot of the times when you try and talk to people about like everybody being a hunter and a fisherman and a scientist and a philosopher, people just kind of roll their eyes and they go, what are you talking about? That's impossible. But it is, I like this framing of, it's the capacity to be able to do that and to act like that, and to get past this idea, hopefully one day, of there being like people and then the scientists that go off and do science, right? And then hopefully with that like matching of capabilities and like access, you would be able to, I don't know, hopefully one day work toward that. And then there's also just the question of like, I suppose politically, what it is that society would want to study versus now. Which I'm not sure any of us could, like, we could hazard guesses, but like, it would be hard to know, right?
Well, that whole idea of the people and the scientists, that's, I mean, a lot of Marxism has that kind of baked in as well, this idea that, like, I only touch on it because it's not really the focus of the essay, but it's a form of Vanguardism in itself. You have the experts and then you have the masses, because the experts, and especially this falls very nicely into the idea of scientific socialism, because these are the people who have the tools to study history scientifically, whereas the masses to some extent don't. And now these lines have sort of been blurred when we talk about the vanguard as the most radical edge of the workers' movement or whatever. But there's still that dichotomy there. So where's this kind of expertise coming from? Like, why are some people capable of grasping it and not others? And to some extent, this can be a slightly like philosophical and abstract debate. So I don't know how much it's worth getting into. Like, I know a lot of the critiques of classical Marxism focus on this stuff. But there is definitely an element of some sort of vanguardism baked into the idea that scientists have some sort of unique insight into the world that others cannot grasp, but can only have it explained to them.
Mm-hmm. And I guess it might be like a presumption of that sort of classical Marxism, which says, as you say, like jumping ahead with the essay a bit, what we're kind of talking about here is the merger formula strategy, right? You have the socialist movement merging with the workers' movement, and you have the socialists as the potential scientists of this formulation who have the time or the knowledge to engage history in a scientific way, and they sort of form the vanguard who teach the workers' movement how to sort of understand the world and engage it. But as you say, like in the sort of idealized conception of this merger formula, there's a overlap between the two, right? Like the socialists become part of the workers' movement, and the vanguard of the workers' movement become socialists. But when it comes down to like actually critiquing this particular strategy, I guess there's a question of like, well, does that actually happen? Is that a presumption that sort of never really came about, and actually what you got was the worst incarnation of Vanguardism, where sort of an intellectual elite is basically in charge, and you never really get that kind of democratization, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, Kautsky was explicit about this, the idea that it was bourgeois intellectuals that would be capable of grasping like scientific socialism and bringing it to the masses. I think it's good that people who are theorizing this stuff today have moved kind of away from that sort of hard and fast edge. And I mean, to some extent, I kind of agree with the idea that, like, whether you are working, I don't know, in a lab like me, or you are whatever you'll do. I mean, we are workers to an extent, so it is in some sense the radical edge of workers. My main issue with like merger formula and the strategy of patience is more to do with this whole notion of like the re-emergence of the workers' movement itself, which I just think conditions like suggest that cannot happen. And so, yeah, that's kind of something I try then to draw out the assumptions of these strategies, and then try and evaluate them based on like the conditions as they exist. And for me, that's doing science to an extent.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I was thinking about when I was reading this, but also when you were speaking before about choosing to focus this essay on questions of Marxist strategy, like obviously the intention of Marxists is to change the world and find ways to intervene, and the intent behind a scientific Marxism, as you've described, is to engage the world with a view to intervening, I suppose. But I guess there's also ways in which you could analyze other aspects of Marxism scientifically, right? You could look at Marx's economic predictions and judge them at the value of that sort of like negative heuristic of a Marxist law, and then look at the various auxiliary statements that surround it that are in an attempt to make it fit more properly with observational data, I suppose. Was it simply that? I guess my question is: was it simply that focus of Marxism to change the world that made you focus on theory in this essay, kind of thing? And am I right to say you could, like, would those other aspects of Marxism sort of represent different research fields of research within Marxism, I suppose?
I mean, I think they tie in. So the critique I draw out of the merger formula strategy of patience, which is like has a very strong literature, is based on the idea that we like the post 73 downturn has been like not so much, I mean, appearing terminal, certainly in the sense that you get these cycles of crises, and when you get this bounce back after the crisis, you're not getting like a restoration of employment to the same level. Aaron Benanav calls this cycles of underemployment. So this means that like and obviously of course you have the fragmentation following neoliberalism, the very nature of work has changed, the service sector has seen a considerable growth, whilst industrial sectors, particularly in the global north, but we're also seeing it in the global south now, it has collapsed to some extent, because there's no more avenues for capitalist accumulation in the traditional sense. And so, I mean, these are very much kind of an evaluation of Marxist economics, and how it then applies to strategy. So I think they're all like greatly interlinked in that sense. And I guess you could argue that advocating for a merger formula strategy of patience sort of framework is arguing, the underlying assumption is that the economic circumstances haven't changed. So I guess I would disagree with that evaluation of the data to some extent. Although quite often it's just a case of it's not really something that's considered. The idea that the workers' movement can be rebuilt is just baked into it.
Yeah, I really appreciated your laying out the sort of fundamental assumptions of these forms of Marxist strategy, I guess, and it provoked me to realize some of my biases, potentially unscientific biases that I was presuming, because every time I engage with the sort of strategy of patience formula, correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like the way you laid it out was like, first we make the build up the socialist movement, we build the sort of party, we unite the various sects into a sort of properly programmatic single Marxist party. We rebuild the socialist movement, and then the socialist movement goes and unites with the workers' movement, kind of thing. And I feel like I fall into the trap of thinking, well, we just build the party, and then the party can somehow like force the situation. Whereas what you're pointing out is that like no, sort of the conditions have changed such that there isn't a workers' movement to merge with, or at least in the way that it used to exist, I suppose. So I found I sort of appreciated that.
It's a very appealing narrative. I remember the first time I read Mike McNair's Revolutionary Strategy, and I was genuinely blown away, partly because of how he approached it. Like, he was very careful in his argumentation, he defined his terms, and it was such a breath of fresh air for someone who had been like kind of coming out of like the whole Corbynist milieu where everything is just kind of vague and kept like, okay, it was never a question about, okay, well, Corbyn gets in, then what? But that sort of thing. And like McNair seemed to be dealing with these things very concretely. So it tends to, it's very precise, but also it kind of gives us a sense of agency where we can follow these steps and we can there is access to power through certain approaches. But I just don't think it holds up on scrutiny. And I think to some extent, like as Marxists, if we want to treat Marxism as a science, then we have to go through those rigorous steps.
Yeah. And I mean, it isn't to say that one day maybe all of a sudden the workers' movement will just come back, right? Like in the graph that you have in your paper, there is like a incredibly small but like slight uptick there right at the end when it goes wherever it ends at like 2020 or something like that. And it's like, this is it. Maybe this strategy of patience is correct. But it's funny because when you talk about that book, like Dan and I had a very similar reaction to reading it for the show where we were just like really impressed with it. And it is honestly still like it is a very impressive work, especially because it kind of goes through all of the assumptions or the kind of criticisms that people have made about previous similar forms of strategy and criticizes them and goes, no, here's how they would all work. But I think what you're saying is true, which is that the underlying assumptions, he basically just doesn't go over, and there's kind of a bait and switch because it's not even discussed. And the main thing is there a workers' movement that is ready to be merged with, right? Like, if that's the case, why do we have like 50 provisional parties hanging around, right? Or like provisional parties that like aren't actually parties. We promise we're not actually parties, right? And that just doesn't get discussed at all, right? And it's interesting. It's just like one step back. And then again, you kind of have to go and kind of like rethink your auxiliary statements or hypotheses, right? And then just kind of go, well, if this core of the Marxist argument is still true about, value and about the exploitation that goes on in capitalist society, where does that leave us? And yeah, I was hoping that you were going to have an answer to that at the end of your paper. I was a little bit upset you didn't tell me what to think. But
yeah, I think this is the thing. Like, people justifiably say to you, well, what do you propose as an alternative? And I mean, I go into some like ideas that I've found useful in terms of things like systems theory, but that's not strategy per se for how we're going to get to socialism and stuff. But I mean, if we're treating this in a Marxist frame, like in a scientific framework, then you kind of have to just evaluate it, and that doesn't mean you necessarily have the answers. Like quite often when you're writing a paper about something, you are critiquing something, and that doesn't automatically like raise an alternative. That doesn't mean an alternative isn't there, but I think using like the language and the tools of science will help finding, I mean, not even finding, but like working through these things. And I agree certainly like with the need for like a regroupment of Marxists. I think the idea of having the forums and the avenues to be able to conduct research and work through like different approaches collectively is super important. And I think the whole push towards democratic republicanism that comes from like this sort of resurgence of neo-Kautskyism is also super important. I just don't think their argument for how to get there holds up. And the crucial assumption isn't that a workers' movement exists, because I think most of them will acknowledge it doesn't. I think it's the assumption that it can be rebuilt, and that's where that's where I think the problem lies. And of course, the minor issue of climate change. But
yeah, it's not worried about that.
Yeah,
I mean that is just like so. I mean, I don't want anyone to ask me for saying this because it's not actually external, but that is so external to like the classical idea of like an orthodox Marxist, like, you know, conception of politics, that it's just like, I don't know whose political project would be best suited to that. Because I don't know, if you're going by that, it's like Blanquism, I guess, right? Just like get in there somehow. Yeah, exactly. So I don't really begrudge anybody for that mistake, even though it is a glaring one.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I say in there that here I am writing a thing, just complaining about other things, and so I can't really.
Yeah, but I mean, also, like, you're allowed to do that. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. So many times people fall back on like Trotskyist, like, I'll just join a Trotskyist party because there's quote unquote like nothing else to do. Like, maybe there's something to that, but then also it's like, if that's what you believe, just go volunteer at a soup kitchen. You know what I mean? Or like join a union and like help. But I don't know. You're allowed to criticize things without having a big, you know.
We can always sort of embrace Jason Moore's approach and just say, well, there'll be opportunities in the environmental collapse. So we'll just like don't be too pessimistic, you know.
Yeah. Don't be too pessimistic. Things will collapse. It's fine. I'm wondering if we should maybe take one more step back and talk about the kind of dichotomy that you use, not dichotomy, the way in which you describe the dialogue between Kautsky, Rosa Luxemburg, and what's his name, Bernstein, right? Because this was a really interesting way of framing these debates that I hadn't heard of, and I was surprised the people that you were citing and the argument that you were making to basically say, actually, Bernstein was like relatively scientific in his conception. He was just doing something completely different to Marxism. He was just creating a whole new research project, right? So that if you could maybe talk a little bit about that and about kind of the scientific, you know, aspects of these three thinkers.
Yeah, I mean, much of this is actually expanding on and borrowed from Michael Buraway has an essay called Marxism as Science, which is really interesting. He's more focused on these debates within the Second International, but it's certainly worth a read. But the general idea is that following the assimilation of the workers' movement into like bourgeois politics, like this you didn't get this increase in radicalism as the workers' movement grew. You got this I guess reformist tendency, and this contradicted sort of one of the tenets of classical Marxism, which is you build a workers' movement, you have this increase in radicalism, and so how can we account for that within the classical Marxist framework? And Bernstein, recognizing these trends, basically kind of just throws the baby out with the bathwater, and his concern isn't. He talks about this evolutionary socialism, which is we can just assimilate within electoralism. We don't need revolution, and we can have a form of socialism that way. Now, in a sense, what he's done is he's recognised what's going on in reality. He's appreciated that the data does not match up with the theory. And so he is accounting for that by saying, actually, this looks fine the way things are headed. And he's chucked out Marxism entirely because according to him, we've reached a period where there's no crisis. Things are heading in a very linear direction. And in that sense, there is a progressive scientific content there because he is recognizing where the problem is, but where there's this lack of where the theory is no longer explaining reality, and he's accounting for that by saying actually an evolutionary path could work. Where the other reason why this is a complete divorce from Marxism is because he's no longer looking at anything close to what inverted commas like a totality. He's just looking at a short, basically his model of society is like if you look at where that ends, it's in a short period rather than looking at things in cyclical terms. So he's seeing things. He's saying, okay, over a period they've just got better and better. We're seeing improved technologies. We're seeing improvement. We're seeing increasing wages. We're seeing through things like the SPD, these workers' canteens, social clubs, and all this. Why can't we just keep doing this? So in that case, he's completely ditched Marxism in any recognizable sense. But there is a scientific content to why he's done that. Now, Kautsky, on the other hand, just kind of shrugs it off, and it's just a case of I think it's mainly around we weren't ready to an extent, and so it's basically saying that it's not the data it's not the theory that's the problem. It's the data, almost like it's kicking the can down the road, and so there's no progressive content there, and to some extent, a lot of Marxists are guilty of this, right? It's a case of that whole Marxism is explained, or was it 12 out of the last 5 crises or whatever? It's this idea that eventually, if we just stick to the same thing, we will be right. But that's kind of an idealism because you've completely divorced yourself from what's actually going on. And I think it's crucial that reality is the ultimate test for any theory of change. And so I think this is where the real issue with Kautsky lies. And this sort of return to the merger formula and strategy of patience has moved things on in the sense, has recognized that, okay, we can't just have this cleavage between the workers' movement and the socialist movement. We can't just have the workers' movement clearly doesn't exist, so we can't just say we'll merge with that. But it still operates under some of the assumptions that we can just rebuild it. And so in that sense, I think this isn't any sort of normative claim. It's not a case of Bernstein good, Kautsky bad. It's a case of Bernstein did recognize contradictions between theory and reality, and Kautsky kind of just kicked that can down the road.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent you kind of understand Bernstein's, maybe not his motives, but you understand why he did that, right? Why he created this kind of heuristic now that we now know as revisionism, right? But then on the other hand, it's things are going well in Germany, so we'll get socialism all over the world. It's okay, well, maybe not, but I don't know. I could imagine if there was a socialist movement of that type and of that scale in the United States now, most Marxists would probably be oh, this is just what you do. Here you go. It makes sense, So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just a question of where the boundaries of your model are, right? Are you is it a case of methodological nationalism? Is it a case of cutting it down to where you're only looking over a certain time scale? And of course, these are things that have to be evaluated. And obviously, it's clear that Bernstein's research program went to absolute shit in terms of like withstanding the test of reality. But I mean, there's plenty of people who still do advocate some sort of evolutionary road to socialism through electoralism and all that. It's probably, in some respect, probably still the most popular like strategy towards socialism.
I mean, also, like, I don't know, speaking for us on the podcast, I think that, like, when it was Bernie in America and Corbyn in the UK, everybody was like, but wait a minute. Like, everyone just kind of forgot about Marxism for a moment and was like, this could be cool. And then it all fell apart and everybody was like, oh, yeah, right. So, you know.
No, yeah, and the Labour Party is the workers' movement, Jack. So you just have to vote for Keir Starmer. It's fine.
Yeah. Commissar Starmer.
But that's where revolutionary strategy was so like important for me, because it was like, no, wait, okay, what happens? You get into government, then what? And yeah, I think it's a really, I think that's how any sort of book on strategy should be written.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, should we move on then to talking a little bit about Joshua Clover's work on the strike? I know Dan and I were talking a little bit right before this about how he's somebody that we've heard his name kind of thrown around a lot before, but never particularly like engaged with his thinking directly. And I guess we still haven't, because we've just read this essay talking about him. But it was really interesting to kind of hear somebody discuss the class nature of strikes in a kind of materialist way, because a lot of times you do just get a kind of, maybe it's more of like a communizer thing where it's like, hey, the strike, that seems like it makes sense. That seems like where the class movement is going. Why not? People strike a lot and strikes are cool. I mean, not strikes. I'm saying the opposite.
Riots.
Riots. Thank you. God damn it. Was I saying strike that whole time? I might have been. Well, I meant riots. I'll go back and edit the word riot into all of that. But it's interesting because in this, he takes a very different approach, right? Where he's trying to walk through periods of accumulation and talk about why strikes are more prevalent. God damn it, why riots are more prevalent at different periods and when strikes are more prevalent at different periods. I'm just going to let you, Viv, start talking before I say strike one more time, but I meant to say riot.
Yeah, I think it's a really compelling narrative. He links, so basically he takes the, gonna mash this pronunciation, the Browdelian cycle of crises and upturns that is articulated by Giovanni Arrighi, and he combines that with Robert Brenner's theory of like the long downturns in '73. And so what his like innovation is he matches this to cycles of riot and strike. So during the an uptick of capitalist accumulation, you see also an uptick of strike activity, and then when you have these downturns, then you kind of see the shift towards the riot. And according to Brenner's long downturn, which I touched on earlier, you have this sort of we're seeing this no more avenues for accumulation. And so you're seeing this long downturn where we're not really seeing like a recovery to the same extent. So you're getting these mini recoveries, but you're seeing these cycles of underemployment. And so Clover is arguing that we've now entered like this long period of riot. I certainly find his periodization really compelling, and I think like you have the whole critique of like any strategy based predicated on the workers' movement right there, because what he shows is that during these periods of capitalist accumulation, you see an increase in strikes and worker power because bosses are more willing to make concessions. And part of the reason they're making more concessions is because there's more avenue for profit. And so it's more profitable to just let workers have a larger slice of the pie to some extent. Whereas when accumulation has ceased, the class struggle in some ways becomes more acute, even though you might argue class power is stronger during these periods of accumulation. It's when accumulation is absent that actually you see like a lot less wiggle room for negotiation there. And this is when the riot then becomes the dominant form of struggle, and where the where the strike is concerned, because it's centered around the workplace, its focus is on the wage. The riot, by contrast, its focus is on social reproduction, because there is no people without the ability to reproduce themselves take to the street. And this is where kind of that distinction really lies. And I do think I agree with this, and I think that's why you can't. Well, I don't think we can rebuild the workers' movement so long as this long downturn continues. Now, looking at this on a global stage, you think, okay, well, China like bailed out the world to some extent, like post 2008, with these massive infrastructure projects, and people look at Africa as the next kind of avenue for accumulation. But each time, you're not getting the same like bounce. And part of the reason is because if you look at like increasing technology, it's not like there's going to be an expansion into Africa and you're going to have this massive level of employment and therefore value extraction and capital accumulation, because with the way technology has increased, with the way automation has increased, these gains of accumulation are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And so this is why we have this long downturn. And so that's kind of what I think is the most useful aspect of Clover. I think this is really insightful and really probably one of the foremost things we have to consider when we're thinking about what we should be doing.
Yeah, I think concretely this really helped me understand something that's really been frustrating me and I just haven't been able to understand recently, which is like my workplace has been undergoing like large restructuring projects for a long time now. But kind of in the previous projects, there was a lot more room for negotiation with the unions. And my workplace was like the management was much more responsive to strike action, right? Or even the threat of industrial action. Whereas now, whenever my union or the other unions at my workplace like threaten industrial action, management just kind of goes, yeah, okay, whatever. They just kind of go, okay, like do your strike. We'll just let people know it's going to be, not business as usual for the next few weeks. And then we'll just kind of get on with it. And it's really frustrating because it's like they're in this kind of period of like this long downturn now where especially the sector that I work in is like really unable to kind of make ends meet. There's a lot more like the management is a lot more capable of just being like, whatever, we'll just lose money for a certain amount of time and just everybody will have to get back to work eventually. There's a lot more wiggle room for them in a really counterintuitive way. And you kind of realize that, just how much the workers' movement as such is tied to these periods of capital accumulation. And it's just really frustrating. It just makes people like, I think, feel very powerless. And in that sense, it's kind of like a feedback loop where we've lost a lot of really radical people on our union, like in our local committee, because they just kind of throw up their hands and go, there's nothing to be done. And then the only people that actually do engage in these workers' struggles are people who are really, fine with negotiating with management and people who are, generally like not as class conscious perhaps as they should be. So it's a really interesting framework. Fortunately, no riots around here to speak of, though. So there's really even that outlet.
Sort of leads me to want to ask the question, like, in that formulation, how much of the like negative heuristic of Marxism is left? Like, how connected is it to the original assumptions of Marx? Now, you were saying like it doesn't really necessarily matter what Marx said; it's more about the sort of like historic evolution of Marxism as a science kind of thing. But whenever I sort of like think about those, that maybe what I describe as like more communizer or left communist discussions of the present moment and political circumstances and strategy, like part of me always just does want to default back to, if we're not going to make certain presumptions about what capitalism is doing or is building in the working class, vis-a-vis a force that's going to transform society potentially, how much have we lost of Marxism? That doesn't necessarily mean that's a bad thing. It's just we're just doing the science, I suppose. Obviously, in that analysis, there's loads of basic tenets of Marxism, right? It's still an analysis of economic development, the cycles of capitalism, crisis, and the circumstances that's bringing about, and the condition that's imposing on people who live under it and the working class existing under it. But it does always lead me to that kind of worry kind of thing. Like, what's left of Marx, I guess.
Yeah.
Or am I with Popper? Do I just go with Popper and say, well, it's all just proven wrong, right?
Falsification.
It can be a science, but it's just bad. It's just wrong.
Never be with Popper. I think it's probably a
good
good life advice. So I think Clover does talk about this, how the classical Marxism has mainly been focused with these periods of capital accumulation. That's been its presumption. That's sort of this is kind of the conditions in which it really arose, and so that was obviously going to be the focus of the time. However, I don't think there's anything really preventing like that baked into it that suggests that that's all it can theorize. Like, it's not like class struggle. For me, I think one of the crucial distinctions here is between the working class and the proletariat. If we focus on the working class as specifically as workers in a workplace, like an industrial working class, then yeah, if our conception of Marxism is predicated on an industrial working class, then yeah, I think we do lose a lot of explanatory power for what is occurring today. However, if we're looking at the proletariat, if we're looking at these processes in which more and more people, both within even like more comfortable professional strata, are being proletarianized, and these processes of lumpenization, which doesn't mean you fall out of the proletariat, it just means you fall into certain, again, the lumpenization is a process that describes like stratification within the proletariat. It doesn't just describe, there's the proletariat and there's the lumpen proletariat, and these are hard and fast classes. And if we start looking at these processes, then we're seeing where cycles of struggle are moving to. And so you still have this root class struggle between capitalists and the proletariat. It's no longer a case that we can use the industrial working class as like the revolutionary subject. And I think that's been clear for a long time. I don't think you have to throw out Marxism in its entirety by any means. I think there is much that holds up. I just think it's a case of not focusing, not assuming that the ready-made revolutionary subject exists in the industrial working class.
Yeah, Thanks for that. It's very clarifying.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that could maybe tie us into a little bit of what you get into at the end of the essay, which is a lot about the relationship that, I don't know, various strategies and various ways of thinking about Marxism as science kind of relate to systems theory. Because so much of, systems theory, at least like second generation systems theory, really tries to smack you over the head by being like, you need to understand the system that you're attempting to control or to steer as it actually exists, right? And not like the mission statement of your system, right? Of your meta system, maybe I should say. Like, this is, Beer's idea of the function of a system is what it does. And the dialectical biologists, they really get into the ways in which the environment, such as you can even like consider that as something that exists outside of the system itself, influences the system in, just like a myriad different ways. So maybe we can get into a little bit now about the ways in which systems theory have kind of influenced your ways of thinking of Marxism as a science, and specifically this idea of the métis, if that's how you say it. I asked Dan, and Dan was like, that's a painter, so hopefully that's not how you, it's not a mispronunciation, but it'd be good to hear you talk about that, I think.
Yeah, so I wasn't really familiar with this idea of Matisse until I read James C. Scott's Seeing Like a State, and I just like it resonated with me instantly. It's this idea that like mostly focused on, I guess, experience. Experience leads us to generate often individualized heuristics for how to navigate the world. And so this is very localized and specific knowledge in a sense. And it is distinct from science when we talk about like science in the sense of a overarching framework that explains the world, that gives us laws that are that are constant across time and space. But I think with this, like with as we start to appreciate more complex systems, as we start to see that, oh, actually, we can't often overarching theories don't hold because there are processes acting in specific ways unique to the system in question. You're actually seeing, to some extent, a bridge of that divide between this notion of science and this notion of Matisse, where you have this kind of more localized knowledge. Now, that doesn't mean like there's like a complete, like the two are going to be indecipherable or anything, but it's this idea that then, okay, well, maybe right now it's not entirely clear what an overarching strategy should be, but we can still apply like system theoretic concepts and these, I guess, more localized concepts at different levels. And this is very much baked into like how Marx talks about his framework for analysis. Like he's looking at things from different vantage points. He's zooming in and he's zooming out, and so it's the way to grasp like the system and its and the subsystems it contains is by being able to focus in and out when you need to. And to some extent, it's this interrelation between localized and like subsystem specific information, like being able to theorize those and how they interrelate to the wider world, that might give us some way to make some headway, rather than just taking like a blanket theory and saying, oh, okay, well, this is the way. Because often we think, I mean, there's obviously the issue of a lot of Marxist theory, like Marxist strategies focus on like the global north, based on the fact that most of them were developed there. But you kind of like look at specific circumstances. You're like, oh, okay, how do some of these things apply there? And it doesn't make sense because we don't really have the theory itself becomes a static thing that's just supposed to blanket everything. And so what you're doing is you are just smoothing out all this complexity without accounting for it in any way. And so it's not like a worked out framework by any means, but I think trying to grapple with how complex systems interrelate is extremely important for any sort of like revolutionary theory.
Yeah, and struggles still exist. You know what I mean? Like very much, you could, if you're looking for something to do and you're like, God, I can't go join the mass party. This is so annoying. I guess I'll just do nothing. It's like struggles still exist. You can still go. You know what I mean? I know that this isn't necessarily the question that you're like grappling with in your essay, but there is always, to me, I kind of get a bit frustrated sometimes because there is always this confusion when a lot of Marxists, communists, anarchists, whatever, talk about like what we should be doing and what you need to do, which is to say, people always try to match what they need to do, what they want to do, what they should be doing with what the class should be doing. And it's like, you know, I don't know, like very rare for those two things to come into confluence for like you to have such a direct like influence on what the class should be doing. Like the class is doing what the class is doing. If you want to figure out what you can go do, like there are a million struggles that you can go out there and help with. The issue is like mapping these struggles together and onto a terrain that as Marxists we're all like very unfamiliar with. You know what I mean? So the listener can't see me, but I'm shrugging.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And I think in some ways you could argue that Marxism has struggled to come to terms with a more complex world in terms of previously we could talk about an industrial working class and capitalists, and there was like a clearly articulated revolutionary subject. And as things have fractured, it's always been, well, I mean, it's not always, but there's a tendency towards like just like flattening out that complexity of how things have become so much more like atomized, and you can't just explain everything in terms of that conflict. That hasn't really been accounted for always.
One day. We'll figure it out. Was there anything else we wanted to get to, Dan? Was there anything else on your mind you wanted to talk about from this essay?
I'm just aware that we never really told the audience, I'm sure they'll go and read Viv's essay, but we never really covered why not the strike, why not be with Joshua Clover, I suppose. And I think, I don't know, like the way you describe it, Viv, it seems that he just goes full communizer and just like presumes the commune as like the ultimate political system that will emerge, and it's sort of untestable presumption that he makes. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I think you have a tendency with communizers, because there's a denial of like the scientific content of Marxism, that it can't be evaluated in scientific terms, and so that kind of leaves you with the ability to make quite vague statements. And so I tried to evaluate Clover's theorizing of the commune in some sort of scientific way. So Clover, after putting together like a very rigorous argument about these cycles of struggle, which I completely agree with, he then does this thing which it seems to be a tendency for a lot of Marxist writers to like shoehorn some sort of theoretical presumption in towards the end. And I understand the inclination, because you don't just want to critique, you want to have some sort of positive outlook as well. But so he theorizes that this cycle of riot is inevitably leading towards the commune form. And he talks about the commune as both a tactic and a necessity, whilst kind of leaving what the commune is and how it's going to come about very vague, and the time frame completely vague as well. And so it kind of, I mean, this book was written not that long ago. It's not even been 10 years yet, but we've not seen anything to suggest a move towards that. But of course, because he's not really theorized it very concretely, we can't evaluate it in any way. So I think it's... This is kind of like, I find myself with communization theory, like nodding along, and then it comes to like some sort of positive statement. I'm like, well, this is just being plucked out of the air. It's completely unrooted from from anything that's going on, compared to everything else you've said that is so well rooted in current conditions. And often there's that they kind of get away without critique for that. What you tend to get is the main critique of communizers as well. They've just kind of absented themselves from having to do anything. But that doesn't really get us anywhere. Like, can we actually critique what's being said? And I don't wish to suggest that Clover represents communization at large. And I think, again, I would put Riot, Strike, Riot as having a similar effect to me as Revolutionary Strategy did, in terms of like incredibly clarifying. But this whole notion of the commune as presumed as just something that's going to appear without rooting it in any like argumentation as to why, I find really unconvincing.
Mm-hmm. I have some sympathy with the idea that there's a sense of necessity behind it, because if you're in these conditions where there's potentially a sort of terminal decline under capitalism, and we're also faced with sort of the destruction to the environment that we're seeing as well, like pitching it as a kind of like socialism or barbarism, and there being this sort of necessity for something to emerge, but then I guess not giving any positive description of that process or what that is, doesn't then give us the opportunity to intervene in a positive way to move toward that, I suppose. So maybe that's the bit that's missing, is the kind of like,
I mean, there's also the question of what there's the question of what the commune actually is, because I mean, as far as Marx talked about the commune, it's like a working class government. Right, so what does he say? Essentially a working class government, the product of the struggle of the producing against the appropriating class, the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economic emancipation of labour. What does that look like in these very, like, because he's talking about commune almost as a tactic, as things like sprouting up in an independent fashion. Now, if that's predicated on class struggle, how are you going to hold that out against an extremely militarized state? Because you're not just talking about an encampment here, right? You're talking about like a working class government.
Mm-hmm. I think collapse.
If that's what
right?
he's talking about.
I think just collapse. Like reading a lot of this stuff, like this is really reminiscent of the Jasper Burns essay in Endnotes 5. And that's, I think, the same reason that so much of this stuff isn't testable, whereas you can hassle the merger theory people all you want, because it's like, where is the fundamental tenet that's supposed to be going on? A lot of the communization stuff, it waits for the revolution to then be testable, or it waits for a collapse to then be testable, right? In a way that you kind of can't really hold it accountable, because it's like, maybe a commune will just show up. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, that, but then it seems like, I don't know, maybe why posit it in the first place? Because it's so, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, yeah, I think it comes probably from a lot of the personal experience that a lot of the people involved in this milieu have. And then it also probably comes from reading the bits that Marx wrote about the Paris Commune. And then it probably also comes from pessimism about the general state of things. And so why posit it? I think you probably said it when they want to like put something positive forward, you know, and it's something that seems like it could be correct. But again, it's like not something I really want to wait for. It's like, I have a very similar feeling about communization stuff where I'm like always really into it. And then you get to the end and you're like, huh, wait, what was this all leading up to? Because it's like, I really enjoyed the Jasper Burns essay. I think it's revolutionary something, but in it he posits this idea that you find in a lot of communization stuff, which is the communist action, right? Which is like, well, what can we be doing right now? Going to where the struggles are and pushing them towards communism. And it's like, what's communism? We don't know. What does pushing it forward look like? We don't actually really know. But yeah, I don't know. It's seemingly untestable intentionally.
Yeah, I mean, I really wanted to try and critique it though, because I feel like it's quite fun to get your teeth into classical Marxism, because there's a lot to work with there, and the communizers kind of get off the hook to some extent. So, but they shouldn't do. Like, we should be applying like scientific critiques of everything.
Yeah, well, we'll do our best. Yeah. You know what? I just realized, unfortunately, I feel a bit bad. Viv, we're going to have to rescind your title of first guest to come on the show twice. Donald did it. Completely forgot about that. He has been on the show twice, so sorry about that, Donald.
To be fair, if I'm going to lose it to anyone, then that's fair.
Hey, write something else. You can be the first person to come on the third time. I'm also very aware in 10 minutes that England's final match of the first stage or whatever it is of the Euros is about to start, and I didn't want to like hold everybody here. Dan, I don't know if you're going to watch that, Viv. I would imagine you're definitely watching it.
I probably will, yeah.
All right. Well, I don't really have a whole lot else to say. I just want to reiterate again, everybody should go read this essay. It's very, very good. And yeah, I guess just like with most things, even if you wind up not necessarily agreeing with it, it will make you think about things differently, especially if you're like a merger theory person. I think it's very much important these ideas are very important to come to, just because, like, you know, I don't know, you need to be challenged in your fundamental assumptions. And I feel like if you're not, that's just where burnout comes from. Like, to say nothing of like, you know, cults of personality or like dogmatism, which are also inevitable in these kind of organizations. But like, I don't know, also just being like, why isn't this thing working? Because I'm kind of struggling with that right now in terms of like union work. I'm just like, why isn't anything changing? Maybe I'll just do it more, and that's definitely not been the case. So yeah, very good. Thanks once again, Viv. Really enjoyed this.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Great. Thank you.
Hey everybody, Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there. Or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.